जय। नामाचार्य श्री हरिदास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से कहो श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि श्री गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। सामवेद भक्तवृंद की जय। पूरा प्रेमानंद। All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Guru and Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd Canto, Chapter 25, the Glories of Devotional Service. This morning is text number 7. This is Devahuti inquiring from her divine son, Kapilade. Devahutir Uvacha Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asat Indriya Harshana Yena Sambhavyamanena Prapana Bandham Tamaha Prabho Devahutiruvacha Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asat Indriya Darshanat Yena Sambhavyamanena Prapanandam Tama Prabho Devahutiruvacha Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asad-indriya Darshanat Yena Sambhavyamanena Prapanandam Tama Prabho Devahutiruvacha Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asat-indriya Darshanat Yena Sambhavyamanena Prapanandam Tama Prabho Devahutiruvacha
Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asad Indriya Darshana Yena Sambhavyamanena Prapanandam Tama Prabho Devahutiruvacha Nirvinna Nittaram Bhuman Asat Indriya Darshana Yena Sambhavyamanena देवहूतिरुवाच
देवहूतिरुवाच
निर्विण्णानितरं भुमाम्
निर्विण्णानितरं भुमाम्
असत् इन्द्रियाकर्षणाम्
असदिन्द्रियदर्शनम्
येन सम्भाव्यमानेन
येन सम्भाव्यमानेन
प्रपनन्धं तमः प्रभो
देवहूतिरुवाच निर्विण्णानितरं भुमाम् असदिन्द्रियदर्शनम् येन सम्भाव्यमानेन प्रपन्नं तमः प्रभो
देवहूतिरुवाच
देवहूतिरुवाच
निर्विण्णानितरं भुमान्
निर्विण्णानितरं भुमाम्
असदिन्द्रियदर्शनात्
असदिन्द्रियदर्शनात्
येन सम्भावनां नान्येन
येन सम्भाव्यमानेन
प्रपन्नं तमः प्रभो
प्रपन्नं तमः प्रभो
Devahutirvacha.
Devahutirvacha.
Devahuti said, Nirvinna, disgusted, Nitaram, very, Bhuman, O my soul, excuse me, O my Lord, Asat, impermanent, Indriya, of the senses, Tarshanat, from agitation, Yena, by which, Sambhavyamanena, being prevalent, Prapanna, I have fallen, Andham tamaha, into the abyss of ignorance. You know the word abyss? Deep. Abgrund, I think in German. Abgrund. Prabhu, O my Lord. Devahuti said, I am very sick of the disturbance caused by my material senses. For because of this sense disturbance, my Lord, I have fallen into the abyss of ignorance. Srila Prabhupada's report. Here the word asat indriya tarshanat is significant. Looks like three words, but in Sanskrit they couple together like railroad cars and become one. So, asat indriya tarshanat is significant. Asat means impermanent, temporary. And indriya means senses. Thus, asat indriya tarshanat means from being agitated, that's tarshanat, by the temporarily manifest senses of the material body. We are evolving through different statuses of material bodily existence, sometimes in a human body, sometimes in an animal body. And therefore the engagements of our material senses are also changing. Anything which changes is called temporary or asat. We should know that beyond these temporary senses are our permanent senses, which are now covered by the material body. The permanent senses, being contaminated by matter, are not acting properly. Devotional service, therefore, involves freeing the senses from this contamination. when the contamination is completely removed and the senses act in the purity of unalloyed Krishna consciousness, we have reached Sat Indriya, or eternal sensory activity. Eternal sensory activities are called devotional service, whereas temporary sensory activities are called sense gratification. Unless one becomes tired of material sense gratification, there is no opportunity to hear transcendental messages from a person like Kapila Dev. Devahuti expressed that she was tired. Now that her husband had left home, she wanted to get relief by hearing the instructions of Lord Kapila. Ma Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swamini Namani Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaura Bari Pacharini Nivishesha Sundar Bari Paschachare Satarani Om Jnanam Timarandasya Gananjana Shalakara Chaksur Militam Jainam Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpa Tubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vyeva Cha Patitanam Bhavanevyo Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha. So this is the beginning of her inquiry to her son, Kapila Dev. He calls him Prabhu, oh my Lord, and also Bhuman, same thing, my master. So she begins by expressing her interest in hearing from him about spiritual life, spiritual advancement, Sankhya Yoga, because she is nirvinna, disgusted, nitaram, very disgusted by this asat indriya tarshanat, the disturbance or the agitation of the temporary senses. So the first point that Prabhupada wants to make in his purport is that there's also Sat Indriya. Asat Indriya, the temporary or impermanent senses, but there is Sat Indriya. We were discussing this last night to some extent, that the soul itself is, we are spiritual persons. And so the soul, Atma, the self, is fully equipped with all senses, being a person. But in the material world, the sensory powers of the soul become manifest in this asat indriya. The soul is actually a person. We are also spiritual persons. We have a spiritual body. That is for engagement in the service of Krishna, who also has a spiritual body. But in the material world, the body is manifest differently, materially. And the senses are also manifest in a temporary way. For what? For sense gratification. What are the activities of this in the spiritual world? The spiritual senses, also sense gratification. But the difference is that spiritual activities, eternal sensory activities, devotional service, which is to say, the activities to gratify Krishna's senses. What we call sense gratification in the material world is the activities to satisfy our own senses. So the distinction is made by Krishnadas Kaviraj and others that in the material world, this impulse to satisfy our senses is called kama. This is translated in English as lust. Lust, particular in English, means sexual desire, But it also has this wider implication of any eagerness to attain pleasure of the senses, of which sexual pleasure is the prototype. We always say it's the standard by which everything else is measured. Sometimes people do something that they found particularly wonderful. They say, "Oh, it was better than sex." So that's always the standard. So this kama means this desire to enjoy the senses in the world to their fullest extent, the pleasure of the senses. The contrasting term is prema, which is translated as love. We have lust and love. Love is the desire to satisfy the senses of Krishna. Or, even in the material world, what we call love is also something I want to see the other person is happy or satisfied. Saint Augustine, the Christian saint, defined love as love means to want the other to be. So, of course, in the material world, what we call love, almost in every case, really behind it, there's lust. I love my children. I want them to be happy and fulfilled in every way. But then if they don't do what I want, then suddenly the love disappears. Because I want my children to go to university and get a big position, so I can say to everybody, yes, my son is this, my daughter is this. If I have to say, well, my son is a Hare Krishna, or something like that, then suddenly I'm very angry, or my daughter marries the wrong person. I never want to see you again. So usually we serve somebody else to satisfy their senses. But there's an understanding that in exchange you'll satisfy my senses in some way. So it's more like business. Where real love is, I will satisfy your senses no matter what you do. And that you don't see in the material world. Characteristically, in the last verse of Lord Chaitanya's Shastika prayers, he says, Aslishyava, he's talking now in the voice of Radharani to Krishna, Aslishyava pararatam pinastumam madarshanan marmahatam karotuva yata tatava viradatalam pato maprananata tusa eva naparaha. You may embrace this maidservant who is devoted to your feet. You may embrace me, or you may step on me, kick me aside, or you may adarshanan marmahatam karotuva, or you may make me by not appearing before me, by not allowing me to see you, you can break my heart. This marmahata is hard to translate really in English, because in Ayurvedic medicine and also military science, the places in the body that are, if you get hurt there, that will kill you. That's called a marma. So if you have you're shooting arrows, you aim at these spots. One mostly is the heart, but other places, this is a marma. So marma hatam, you can hit me, kill me in these places. If you don't. Yata yata va viradata lava. Whatever you do, Krishna. And she calls him a lampata, which, I don't know, modern English, there's no playboy maybe. He's like, he has many girlfriends. After all, he's a lampata, what can I do? This is his nature. Nevertheless, whatever he does, he is the Lord of my life, prananath, and there's no other. So this is the expression of love. It's absolutely, there's no conditions. So in commenting on this verse, Prabhupada writes that a devotee has no other way of experiencing happiness except by seeing that Krishna is happy in all respects. So when love for Krishna really develops, there's this intense, greedy desire, not to satisfy my senses, but to satisfy Krishna's senses. And if somehow or other my unhappiness makes Krishna happy, then my unhappiness becomes my happiness. This is love. So when the love for Krishna is there, actually in that case the devotee is really satisfied. It sounds a little strange, but the more we forget about our own happiness, to the extent that we forget about our own happiness, and to the same extent be concerned with Krishna's happiness, at that point our own happiness increases. But when we forget about Krishna's happiness and be concerned with our own, then actually we suffer. This is the real fact of the matter. So even when people are religious in the material world and they worship God, you find out in so many cases they want something from God. They're worshiping God and they're serving God and they say, I love you, God, but really I expect from Him that He will give me something. In many cases, what I want is something material, strictly material, from God. So I'm expecting I will serve God, and that somehow or other He will make sure that nothing bad happens to me, that I don't get sick, that I don't become unemployed, that I don't become poor, whatever it is. I expect this. And when it doesn't happen, then I start to think maybe there is no God. There are a lot of, because of this idea of the relationship with God, because this is the source of a great deal of atheism. Srila Prabhupada tells the story when the communists were beginning to take power in Russia, at that time there was also a famine. There was nothing to eat. The historical fact was they caused it, either deliberately or by mismanagement or a combination of both. But actually, there was nothing to eat, and the people were very hungry. And so they came to the commissars, the agents of the Communist Party, which was in control, and said, "We are hungry. We have no bread." And they said, you go to the church, you pray every day, give us this day our daily bread. That's in the Bible, give us this day our daily bread. So you pray like that, so ask the priest for bread. And the priest says, well, I don't have any bread. So then the commissar says, now you ask us, give us our daily bread. So they asked the party officials for their bread and say, yeah, here's some bread. That point was made. So then people They don't go to the church anymore, and they replace their God with the Communist Party. So it's this idea that God is there His purpose is to satisfy my senses. People think like that. So this is actually not pure devotional service. Means you do not ask for anything from Krishna. This is free from all karma. Jnana karmadi anavritam. Bhakti means there's no desire for anything selfish. So I'm worshipping God to get this result. And when it says jnana, also when our only desire is our own salvation. People are suffering in this world, but their idea is that I will go to heaven and then I will not suffer. And most people, at least when I was growing up, and people, Christian family circle and friends, their idea of heaven was a place of sense gratification, but better. But basically, all the consumer goods you could want, and nice houses and everything is clean, and Jesus is somehow there, I don't know, walking around. But really, the point is that your senses are yours. They just imagine superior sense gratification. In the Vedas, this idea of heaven is, of course, Svarga, the heavenly planets, material. It's strictly material. The higher idea is, of course, of liberation, moksha. But when that also is just the desire for my own liberation, and also is not love. I am worshipping Krishna only for liberation. What's my idea of liberation? I merge and become one with God. And then there's no Krishna. When I merge into the Brahma Jyoti, Krishna disappears. So I'm worshipping Krishna for Krishna to go away. That's also not love. Therefore, Prabodhananda Saraswati has a prayer where he describes this kaivalya, this oneness, as hell. For a devotee, it's hell. Because wherever Krishna is not, that's hell. So this liberation is hell. So real love is simply desiring to satisfy Krishna's senses. And because we are part and parcel of Krishna, that's where our own satisfaction comes. The hand is part of the body. And for the hand to be nourished and satisfied, it has to pick up the food and put it in the mouth and feed it to the stomach. The stomach enjoys. So there's a story about how all the senses got together and decided, what is this? We are working so hard and we're just giving food to the stomach. And that fellow just sits there and does nothing and enjoys. This is not right. Let's go on strike. So all the senses went on strike. They weren't going to feed the stomach anymore. And of course they became very, very weak and unhappy, and finally realized that by serving the stomach they were satisfied. So that's our real satisfaction, is serving Krishna. We serve Krishna, and because we are part and parcel of Krishna, we actually find our own satisfaction. But when we come into the darkness of ignorance, called in this verse Anda Tamasaha. Tama means ignorance, and Anda means blindness. Where we don't see Krishna. We are blind. We don't see Krishna. And then we think that our happiness comes from our own satisfaction, independently of Krishna. And then there's like the hand that picks up the food and thinks it's going to eat like this, so this is like material sense gratification. You're chewing and you're chewing and you're chewing, and you don't get any satisfaction, as Mick Jagger famously sung, I can't get no satisfaction. At least then one becomes interested in spiritual life. Prabhupada writes here in the purport, unless one becomes tired of material sense gratification, there's no opportunity to hear transcendental messages from a person like Kapila. So this is really the first understanding. If one really wants to become interested in spiritual life, this condition has to be there, like Devahuti. Nivinna nitaram asat indriyatharshana. I am completely disgusted with the disturbances caused by these temporary senses, because I have learned that there is no satisfaction. Same word, Krishna tells in the 11th canto, Krishna talks about devotional service, the beginning of it, that a devotee is nivinna sarva karmasu, uses the same word, disgusted with all material activities. So that disgust will, we sooner or later find this out. I mean, we have many births in which we to discover the temporary nature of the world. But the trouble is, this place is called Maya. And Maya means you are not very clear about what's happening. We are in illusion. So people, even after they have some experience, their material desires don't go away. They don't know what to do, even when they become disgusted. The problem with what is the problem with the material world? In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives the different. There's a list of the different items of knowledge. In the 13th chapter, and one is knowledge of the evils of birth, death, old age, and disease. Janma, mrityu, jara, vyadhi, dukkha, doshana, darshanam. One sees very clearly the evils of these three things: janma, mrityu, jara, vyadhi. These four things are listed as the problems of life. Why is that? Well, because if we want to be happy, we have to solve the problem of birth. This means getting born again and again and again. But birth itself is actually an unpleasant experience for the person that's being born. Usually for the mother also, it's suffering to be packed up in a womb and to come out. So there's birth. And then these things happen, that one becomes old, jara, vyadhi, disease is there, and then mrityu, death. So if one wants to become happy in this world, you have to solve these four problems. So this means that many things we are doing to become happy do not deal with these problems. We think if I get enough money, I'll become happy. But even in the wealthiest of circles, janma, mrityu, jara, vyadhi, these four things are going on. What to do? If I get enough money, if I get a good education, if I live in the right place, if I have the right friends, so many different efforts are there for happiness. But birth, death, old age, and disease, no matter where you are, they are there. So really, we have to say to people, we must solve the death problem. Now, sometimes people say, "No, I'm not worried about that." In fact, there was a survey at one point taken in America, and they asked people what are they afraid of, and death was fairly far down on the list. At that time, the number one fear when this survey was taken was unemployment. But let's look at that. Why are they afraid of unemployment? Well, what happens if you can't get a job or you lose your job? Well, then I won't be able to eat. Well, what happens if you won't be able to eat? Well, then I'll die. You see, so it's the death problem. But if I think unemployment is the problem, then maybe I can do something about it. I can get some education, or I can vote for the other political party that's promising jobs or something. I can do something. But when there's death, what am I going to do? So actually we spend a lot of time not thinking about these problems. I actually have had people come and tell me, this one young lady, she was in college. She told me that, confided to me that she thought she was not going to die. She just couldn't imagine it happening to her. And she said that when she became old enough for it to be a problem, they will have solved it. It will be over there somehow. But first of all, she's young. She thinks it's not a problem now. But of course, young people die all the time. But somehow when you're young, you think, yeah, it won't happen to me. It's for those other people who are old or in unfortunate countries. They have death there. There's death in Africa, but not here. So sometimes we think we're so wonderful and so special that the universe is so arranged that nothing bad will happen to me. Now this is our illusion. So you have to solve the death problem. In fact, the way the material world is working is that the word asat here is impermanent. You see, in this world we try to become happy by putting our senses into contact with the various sense objects. But this contact is very temporary. It's not stable. And even if we have a nice situation, we have a good girlfriend or a nice husband or a good job or whatever, it's still shaky. At any time it can fall apart. And so even when we have what we want, we are in anxiety that we can lose it at any time. Sometimes we don't think about it, but underneath, it's the anxiety of material existence is always there. Actually, the foundation of being in the material world is a kind of fear or angst that is always there. We're so used to it, we don't even realize it. So this is the condition that they say we have to come to this understanding that in the material world there's not real happiness. There's something that we call happiness because we want it, but it doesn't really satisfy it. Satisfy our needs. So we bring our senses into contact with the sense objects, and there's always fear and anxiety, and then sooner or later it's broken. These relationships that we set up for happiness, they are inherently impermanent. And they get broken all the time. Different things happen. People die, people move away, friends become enemies, circumstances changes. So these relationships are always unsteady, and they break. When they break, we really feel so unhappy. We're miserable, we're unhappy, we're depressed. Why are we depressed? Why are we unhappy when these relationships come apart? Well, because we wanted them to keep on going. And if we ask ourselves, how long did we want these to last? We have to say, well, as long as I can get. How about forever? So here's the predicament. Our actual desire is for some kind of happiness that does not come to an end. That's what we really want. Where are we looking for this? In a place where everything is temporary. This is called mission impossible. There's such an incompatible situation between what we really want and what's available that we will never be satisfied. Now we have to ask ourselves, why do I want some happiness that never comes to an end? Where does that desire come from? Why is it so deeply rooted? It is because we are actually Sat. We are eternal. We are permanent. So here's the incompatible situation. We are Sat. The nature of the soul, Sat Chit Ananda. So we are Sat. But we're in the place where everything is Asat. It doesn't fit. Therefore, everybody who is wise, Buddha, this is the word Buddha means wise. So Buddha said one of his noble truths is that life is suffering. Dukkha, he used the Sanskrit word dukkha, it is suffering. Because of this inherent incompatible situation. Therefore, in the 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Yehi samsparsaja bhoga dukkha Yehi samsparsaja bhoga dukkha yonaya evate. This is a very interesting statement by Krishna, that those pleasures, this is the word bhoga, that means pleasures, that arise from the contact between the senses and their objects, samsparsha. Sparsha means contact. We bring our senses into contact with the objects in the material world, and bhoga, there's some enjoyment. So he says, Yehi samsparsaja bhoga dukkha. I get the other word in my mind. Dukkha yonaya evate. They are in fact the cause, or give birth to all suffering. Use that word dukkha. The pleasures we gain in the material world by sense gratification, in fact, are the cause of our suffering. I mean, we don't think that they are. We come into the world and we enjoy ourselves and we say, well, I just have to keep this going and make it more intense and make it more insecure. But no, he says, is the source of all suffering. So ultimately, why is that? Well, we are, as the Vedas say, that in this material world we are in illusion. We are under the spell of Maya. And that the suffering comes because we are eternal. Our identity, that's the self, is Sat, spiritual, eternal, full of knowledge, full of bliss by nature. But we are in the material world because we identify ourselves falsely as these bodies. If I think of who I am, I will think of this body with all its designations: male, female, white, black, American, German, Russian, old, young, good-looking, ugly, whatever it may be. All these different names. This is me. Well, the Vedas says that is not you. This is a body. But we have identified with the body. So the first lesson of spiritual life, entry level, for anyone who wants to be wants to get beyond the material world, is Aham Brahmasmi, the Vedas say. Aham Brahma, I am Brahman. You know, there in the Vedas, there are different paths or different schools of those people who are following spiritual advancement and disagree on different things. But everybody agrees with this. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. That means to say that I am spirit. Now, if I am spirit, the corollary, logically, is that I am not matter. Which is to say, I am not this body. Actually, according to the Vedas, the body has two layers. The gross body, made of earth, water, fire, and so on. And then the shukshma sharira, the subtle body, which is described as manas, buddhi, ahankara. What we would call the mind, but it's actually more fully understood in Vedic terms. But the subtle body, also the material body, you have these two coverings, two layers, the gross and the subtle. I'm not this body, I'm not this mind. The good news on both accounts, really. But we identify with this body. We are rooted in it, and we think of ourselves as this body and as this mind. If you say, I am not the body, I'm not the mind, then what am I? What else is there? What's going on? So, of course, the first thing is that we learn. The sun's we learn that, and you say, I am the self or the soul. What's that? Well, of course, we look for the soul. The symptom or the sign of the presence of the soul is consciousness. Consciousness, the ability to be a subject and to undergo experiences. This does not arise from the body or the mind, but is from the soul. And that consciousness. And now the real spiritual life is the purification of this consciousness. But because when the consciousness becomes purified, and when the garbage becomes removed off top, then our whole real identity becomes developed. But right now, the only thing is just that consciousness, which is now contaminated consciousness, because this consciousness is invested in or identifying with this material body, this material mind. This is called ahankara, my wrong idea of who I am, of false ego, my false sense of myself. I am the body, I am the mind. Now we discover that even though, let's say, I am a follower of the Vedas, I accept Aham Brahmasmi, I know I'm not the body, just thinking about this as an idea does not remove this identification of myself with the body. I can say I'm not the body all I want, or I'm Aham Brahmasmi all I want, but still, when something happens to this body, I think, oh, it's happening to me. I cut myself with a knife. Oh, look, I'm wounded, I'm hurt, I'm in danger of dying. And I've become full of fear and anxiety, and my whole concern is with the happiness and the distresses of this body. I'm all involved in that. I'm not at all any idea that I'm anything else. So this ahankara, where does this come from, this identification of the self with the body? It comes from samsparsaja bhoga. The more we try to enjoy the more we enjoy the senses in the world, the more we identify ourselves with the material body. So this identification and with the material body, this happens because of material sense pleasure. And because of that identification, then everything that happens to the body, I experience as happening to myself. So once in a while, there are a few brief flickers of pleasure. when you're young, the body for a short time is very delightful. Not all the time, but now and then something nice happens. But then old age comes, disease comes, and death comes. And the whole business with the body is that the same body which when we were young becomes a source of pleasure and delight, now all those senses become the cause of suffering. And there's no way around this. Medical science, pharmacology, this will not solve this problem. Basically what we do is we trade off one sort of suffering for another suffering. Yeah, you can get rid of some pain by taking drugs, but you also stop being alive. Your senses just become dull completely. You turn into a plant. And then you say, this is happiness? So this is the problem. So yehi samsparsha ja boga dukkha yonaya evate. This is a fact. It's just a fact of life that these pleasures which arise from the contact with the sense of the object are in fact the cause of all suffering. The verse continues, adyantavanta konteya. These senses have a beginning, adi and anta. They have a these pleasures have a beginning and an end. So that's the problem. They start at a certain time and they end at a certain time. And therefore, those who are buddha, as the word is used in the Bhagavad Gita, those who are wise, they do not take any delight in them. Well, when people come to this conclusion, and many people in the material world find out these things about the world, but generally they become, what happens to those people? They become very bitter and angry and frustrated, and generally they simply try to commit suicide. There's the slow form of suicide. It's called alcohol, intoxication, anything to kill your consciousness. The world has become so horrible that they simply want not to be alive, and so they find out some way to occupy the time. Some people, of course, literally commit suicide, which is also not a solution. Because then you have the birth problem. You keep on going, and now you've made things worse for yourself. And so the alcohol and other drugs. The extent to which the whole material world, human society is running on drugs is really remarkable. And then there are other forms of destroying your consciousness. Television, for example. Gambling. Anything to just put your mind into some stupid little thing that is sort of doing things and you can. Anything to lower your consciousness. This is not happiness. Why are people embittered and upset and cynical when this happens? Because we want happiness, we want delight, we want pleasure that doesn't come to an end. So this is where we have to understand that desire for happiness or pleasure and delight comes with the soul. We have just placed it in the wrong place, put it in the wrong place, in the material world. That won't work. We have to understand that this gradually one will, if we're fortunate, we discover Sat Indriya, what Prabhupada calls Sat Indriya, the eternal sensory activities. a devotional service. So this is what Kapila is going to teach, the final solution, not to gratify the senses in the material world, nor not try to destroy the senses by some spiritual, so-called spiritual process where you just try to negate them. This idea of a total negative idea of salvation is another form, is a kind of, Prabhupada calls it spiritual suicide. Again, to kill the self. Because they think now this whole world is full of is horrible, and now all I can think to do is nothing. In Germany, you have a philosopher who did this so very well. This position, Schopenhauer. If anybody has read Schopenhauer, he's a very good writer and makes a very good thing. Yeah, because Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. It's quite a book. This longing for annihilation, because to become free from the will that drives you on and on. In this suffering, Schopenhauer had read the Upanishads and had become quite influenced by Indian philosophy, but he was so in the mode of passion that Brahman to him was not like the underlying unity of the world was the will, Divila. Expressed in the desire for control, dominance, enjoyment, and so on. So this negation or annihilation is ultimately not satisfaction. Happiness is not just the absence of pain or suffering. Many people think like that. That's the best that can be achieved. There's a joke in America in a university. A new student went to a fraternity association of students where everybody was an athlete. They were football players, American football players. And football players are, the joke, of course, always known for being somehow stupid. Anyway, he goes into this fraternity for everybody's a football player, and he sees this one guy standing next to a wall and smashing his head into the wall over and over again. He's smashing. And he says, finally he says, why are you doing that? He says, because it feels so good when I stop. So most people's idea of happiness. So we have something better, and so this is what Devahuti is looking to hear from Kapila Dev, who will teach her the process of devotional service. So. First, we have the bad news that one should understand the faults of material existence. There's a lot of because we invest so much in this life, we keep ourselves deluded. One famous actress, stage performer, Josephine Baker. An American black lady who became very famous in France. She would go on stage in a very artistic way, take her clothes off, and she became quite celebrated for this. And so in her old age, she must have been in her 70s, she was asked to make a final appearance. So somehow she finally agreed to it. So in Paris, everybody came. She was so famous and celebrated and everything. So she was on stage beginning. She would just wear a little belt of bananas or something. I've never seen it myself. Anyway, so she noticed that somebody in the audience had these little binoculars, these opera glasses for a closer look. And she stopped the performance and said, "You there with the opera glasses, put them away." She said, "Preserve your illusions. It's all you have." So we sometimes we want to preserve our illusions because we think it's all we have, and so we cling to them. Or because we like to go and we like to see the cinema, the Hollywood movies with a happy ending. You have the young people, young and attractive, and they meet each other and they fall in love. But then something happens. There's some intervention. There's some misunderstanding between them, or some other interference, and so they're separated. And so the movie, they struggle and they overcome whatever obstacles there are, and in the end they get together again. And everyone's happy, and maybe they get married or whatever, but they're together, and they go off into the sunset, and the music comes up, it says the end, they live happily ever after, and everybody's joyful. What isn't life wonderful? Just keep the camera rolling. Don't stop. Just see what happens. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, keep rolling. So we have these things to make it look better. So I don't mean to be like Schopenhauer, so totally pessimistic, because it's really the foundations of optimism. We can do something about it. One should be pessimistic about this material world, but the point is that what we have to place our desire for happiness in the real place, in devotional service, in Krishna consciousness. There, when we have contact with Krishna, even though we're in these material bodies, these same senses, which are the cause of our bondage, used in Krishna's service, become the cause of our liberation, and our eternal life begins now. We perform devotional service here, and that becomes our permanent engagement. For a devotee who's fully absorbed in devotional service, death is negligible. If death is the ultimate failure to perpetuate our relationships, for a devotee it doesn't happen. Because the relationships that a devotee has with Krishna, with the other devotees, that goes on. It's not at all disturbed. So one has already conquered death. It's just a change of location, but not a severance actually, it's an improvement, a better location usually. Or there's just no difference at all for the devotee. Actually, for one who's fully engaged in devotional service, the material world becomes as good as the spiritual world. It's actually no obstacle for any happiness whatsoever. Because one sees Krishna everywhere in Krishna's. Because the illusion is gone. Naturally, in the material world, one sees other people suffering, and that becomes a source of unhappiness for a devotee. But the suffering that people, from a devotee's point of view, when people are suffering in the material world, it's like watching your little child have a nightmare. You know he's safe, but he's dreaming at night and there's suffering. You wake him up. That's all. And once we wake up, once the covering of darkness is removed, we see, I'm this eternal spirit soul. Here, this material world, everything is temporary, but actually everything is also Krishna's energy. I see everything in relationship to Krishna because I use everything in Krishna's service. We want to see the relationship with Krishna. We want to see God everywhere and everything in God. We have to use everything in God's service. As soon as I take what belongs to God and use it for my own purposes, God vanishes. So people want this. They want this vision of a pantheistic vision. They want to see God everywhere and everything in God. And it's true. That's true. God is everywhere. Everything is in God. But as long as we're using the things that belong to God for our own sense gratification, then we will not see this. Otherwise it's just a sentiment. But for the reality, we have to engage everything in God's service. So in that way, our relationship with Krishna becomes established here in the material world. Even, it's not that you have to wait till you die. No, devotional service begins now, and it just goes on, and it never ends. So once we begin devotional service, we have already entered into our eternal life, and the death problem is finished. Birth, death, old age, these, they may go on with the body, but they don't offer any inconvenience for the devotee. And that's what we need to learn in this world, so we can actually find our real happiness. Scott, any questions or comments? No? Yeah?
My question is about the today's.
Well, okay, just hold. Let's see if anybody has anything in particular from today. Then we'll go to yours. Yeah.
When you started seminar at 9. I read a seminar. So maybe we just don't take.
Oh, now?
Yeah.
It's here for now. Okay. But nobody told me. You have to tell me.
Yeah.
So you can ask me outside, because there are people here for the Ayurvedic seminar. This is also medicine. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.